Hello and welcome to the currently unnamed movie podcast. It's so good you'll bust a nut. My name is Cole. I'm joined by Asuka.
Hello.
We're a podcast about movies. We got sidetracked last episode, but now we're absolutely back on track. I suppose we should give a little bit of backstory. Asuka, my co-host, is a film student.
That I am.
I am a nothing student. And so we figured, why not use the assets we have, right? Why not have Asuka give us a bit of a lecture on something movie related, and I can be here to ask the questions that a dumb idiot would ask, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm mostly interested in Japanese films, so that's a thing I read a lot about, and I wanted to just also for myself, to work through all the stuff I've read. I wanted to give a short introduction about different parts because we are a shorter podcast, right? We don't want to sit here for 3 hours and talk about the entire history of Japanese film. We're just doing the intro bit. So what I've got noted down is up to about 1930, about when sound in film was a thing that happened and sound film died. And yeah, I'll just give a short introduction, right? And maybe explain some things that give us an idea of where Japanese cinema was at before the Second World War, which we can later work upon in a topic I know a fair bit about because I actually talk about this person in uni, is Akira Kurosawa, the most famous Japanese director of film history, both in Japan and internationally, I think. Internationally, definitely. In Japan, I don't know, but probably. So we could do an hour just... We could do way more than an hour just about Kurosawa, but
You could talk forever about
yeah,
Kurosawa.
yeah, Kurosawa's. I mean, I have an entire seminar just on Kurosawa, so that's 13 times 90 minutes, right? Just about Kurosawa, and that's not exhaustively talking about it. There's a lot to be said about famous film directors, right? And I think the Japanese New Wave is an interesting topic that we could get to. But for all of this, we need this certain base, this certain foundation, and we're not doing the entire foundation. I think Second World War would also be important, but I'm not as cleaned up on that yet. So we're doing just before the Second World War, do the first golden age of film.
Yeah. So you're getting a film student degree for free.
Yeah.
So, like Asuka said, this is going to be early Japanese history from the birth of Jesus Christ until the 1930s, right?
Yes, approximately, right? I mean, there are films about Jesus, right? There was that... I forgot what that film was. It was a Western film where someone looked for an actual camcorder that was supposed to be there at the Last Supper.
Yeah,
it was a weird film.
It's aliens, right?
Yeah, I don't actually remember how that film ended, whether it turned out that actually the person looking for it was there and he time traveled there, or whether it was just fake. It was weird. There was also a famous actor there, but I don't remember which one. If it's not Nicolas Cage, I don't remember it. Right? The only important American actor.
Face Off was the first movie, actually.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah. But yeah, so hopefully this all sounds interesting. If anyone is like me and grew up, watching anime, I guess we both did. The history of Japanese filmmaking should at least spark some amount of interest, I would assume.
Yeah.
And I will interject and interrupt at random moments to ask stupid questions as well.
Yeah, so without further ado, let's get started on the actual first film, which is not Face Off. It is Workers Leaving a Factory. This is a French film by the Lumiere brothers. They made the kinematoscope, which is just the early... It's both a camera for filming and a projector for projecting films. So both in one. They made this in 1895. They like unveiled what they had been working on. Same time, Thomas Edison made the Edison camera in the US. So we have like two different ideas, but Edison's was like less cool because it didn't actually project the film. You had to look through a little lens, so it wasn't as like well suited for the public, right? Because only one person could also always be watching these films, while the Lumieres could show it to further people and make it like an instant sensation.
Yeah, he wasn't very smart, that Edison guy.
Yeah, he, you know,
Probably didn't accomplish much at all during his
exactly.
life.
Yeah,
What year did you say they made the cameras?
1895.
1995.
18.
1895. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
I misheard there.
okay, yeah, so in 4 years, at the time of recording, we'll be at the 130th anniversary of cinema.
Oh,
So
that's not as old as I thought, to be honest.
I mean, you know, it is very much an art form of the 20th century, right?
Yeah.
Like, so the thing with early film, especially Lumiere, they also made a lot of films, but back then films were like at most 3 minutes long because like there was just not enough space on the film reels.
Yeah. Better times.
And the Lumiere brothers, they really, so their names were like Louis and Auguste Lumiere. They made like these really almost documentaries, but like very obviously staged when you look at them nowadays, just like proof of concepts of moving pictures. So Workers Leaving a Factory was actually just stationary camera that filmed people coming out of the factory when like they finished working there. It was actually also a factory of the brothers Lumiere.
Oh.
So you can see, like, you can look this up on YouTube. They like most of the old films are on there in like refurbished quality. So that's just
Yeah. They would like belong to the people, most of them, right?
I mean, no, this was still like not when people could make their own films, right? Because there weren't that many cameras and like, just like mostly it was like the Lumieres making them or selling them for like a lot of money.
Yeah, but I mean, like these movies, the old ones, are they like trademarked still, or are they more in the vein of?
Oh yeah, no, probably not.
There's a word
Right.
for it that my Swedish brain can't think of.
Yeah, same. Public domain.
Public domain. That's the
That's
word I
the
was
word.
looking for.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I'm not that sure on the copyright things, but probably. Like, genuinely, who cares about it, right? You could probably sell like a Criterion collection of all the first films, but like 5 people would be interested in buying that.
Yeah, you could sell the Workers Leaving Factory NFT if you want.
Yeah, exactly. So why is that important for Japanese history? Because in 1896, Edison came to Japan with his thing, and they thought it was pretty cool. But very late in 1896, the Lumiere brothers came over with their thing. Well, they had a representative. They sent a dude over to Japan, and the Japanese thought that was even cooler. So a friend of the Lumieres, a Japanese friend of theirs, bought 2 cameras, and this is the start of Japanese film. The first Japanese film is En route à Tokyo, filmed by by the dude who worked for the Lumiere brothers. I think his name was Gillet or something. Just some French dude. He just put up a camera in like Tokyo, filmed the street, like just people walking by. There was like a rickshaw, and it's 1 minute long, and that's the first Japanese film.
Yeah.
Very much in the vein. There's one of the early ones is like just filming people doing kendo, though it's not. It looks very weird if you look from it from like a modern viewpoint, because it's really just like people swinging around swords and like the whole kendo gear. It doesn't look like there's any plan to what they are doing, which is very much not how we know kendo, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's a very elegant art form,
Is
like a
that
sport.
was kendo like that back then, or is this like the French people trying out kendo?
I don't actually know. Like, it might just be like, someone putting up the camera and being like, yeah, do something interesting, right? At like a dojo, and then they are just like you can really see it's not 1 versus 1. It's like several people just like walking through each other, basically. It's interesting to watch. Once again, if you look up the French name, which I forgot. But you can see this on Letterboxd. So if you look up, yeah, it's a bit stupid. I'll put it in the description
Yeah.
actually, because I think this one's like worth watching. Just if you want to watch some early, just put the YouTube link there because you need the French title. And if I don't
Yeah.
remember like the director's name or like the movie's name, that's pretty hard. I'll put it in the description.
I mean, relevant links in general can probably go
Yeah,
in the description for this one, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So that's how that started. Another big part, once the Japanese started doing their own films, so around 1900, like where they started making more interesting, basically films, is that they took a lot of these kabuki plays and just filmed them. Kabuki, I think you probably heard of it, right? This like
Yeah, that's
Japanese.
the where they have all the makeup.
Yeah, exactly. Like this very
Yeah, the
heavily made up
big.
like theater thing. Often
Yes.
historic stuff. There's like a big thing about Japanese film is also that like not about film but about kabuki theaters, that often the action was not shown but
Oh
it
yeah.
was talked about, right? So it would be like, have you seen Katana Gatari, the anime?
Oh no, I've been wanting to.
Okay, so there's at one point in the middle there's this one duel that is like very much built up, right? It's a protagonist against the strongest swordmaster of all time. And
Yeah.
the preview for the episode, I think it's episode 6, is like, this battle will now take place on this island. And then episode 6 starts, and it's the two protagonists sitting at like a dango restaurant and talking about how cool that match was.
Yeah,
Right?
I mean, if you can't get the animators to come in that way, right?
Yeah, it's like wonderful. Like it's like the biggest like bait ever, right? It's a lot of fun, and it's like basically a reference to this old style of talking about talking about how the action happened rather than the action happening.
Yeah, I love that.
Um,
Modern filmmakers should take a note of that.
it's something that should probably be seen more often. It's fun.
Yeah.
Um, so a lot of film early on was just like filming these theater plays so you could show them elsewhere, while Western film around like 1905 started being original stuff, right? Narrative cinema started around 1905. Japanese film was also very often shinpa. Shinpa is a variation on kabuki, so basically the same stuff, but it was more modern stuff, right? Like the troubles of modern people in like theater plays. And so we had like more that for foreign films, because like foreign films were very popular. Lots of them were produced. They came over to Japan, but Japanese people didn't really understand what they were seeing because, like, just like Western and American clothing styles and just that wasn't very obvious. I think that like sounds very weird nowadays that you cannot understand what you see. But if you look at like something like the kendo film, like the 1 minute kendo film, that's very like it is confusing. So they had people who
Yeah.
narrated them. These were the benshi. The benshi was like basically someone who would explain this originally, and later when the films got a bit longer, they would actually like they would like even voice the characters on screen. That's
Okay. So
um,
they were their voice was inserted into the movies.
no, they stood there
They
at
they
the
explained during the showings of the
yes,
movies.
exactly. They stood in front
Yeah.
of the screen and explained what was happening. And
Yeah.
later, like the good ones made like voices and sometimes even added their own stories, right?
Oh.
So they became basically the first stars of Japanese cinema because you could actually go to a theater because a certain good benshi would work there.
Yeah. Because
Uh,
this is before you could even add sound to movies.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Plus,
I caught myself there.
yeah. So there was also obviously like music being played, but the same was in the West. You also had like people playing like actual music in front of the screen, like early film music. But the banshee, that was like a specifically Japanese thing.
Yeah. This all sounds really exciting. It's
Yeah,
I
I
think it would be really interesting if we tried doing something like that, like with modern.
mm,
Um, yeah,
yeah, yeah.
that's
I can highly recommend. I've only seen one banshee narrated film so far. It's Arashi. It's a samurai film about like a samurai due to a misunderstanding. He becomes exiled from his like school by his master. He becomes a ronin, and he's just like he's an ultimate simp. He just always wants to make a woman happy, but they didn't
Don't
misunderstand
we
him.
all?
Yeah, they misunderstand him, and then he gets like by accident associated with criminals, and everything just like you know, it all comes tumbling down,
Yeah,
as they say.
that sounds great. I
It's
uh, I love Ronin.
Yeah, it's like a very fun film, and the bench narration adds so much. It's like a woman. The recording I had is like a woman that also does all the voices, and when a character is introduced, she's like, "This is that character played by this actor." It has this like bedtime story feeling. It's
Oh, okay.
genuinely charming. I can highly recommend Orochi, which should also be on YouTube, I think. So I'll put a link for that
Yeah.
into
You
the
you
screen
said
as well.
sometimes they even added their own stories, the Benchi?
Yeah, I think that's more for like just like exaggerating the story and stuff, right?
Oh, okay.
Stuff like if someone walked by who was just like a background character or something, I think they could have been like tell a story about them. There's
Oh,
there's
okay.
there's some like more modern stuff that is like this. I had this in a seminar. There's a British film called A Girl Chewing Gum is the English word.
Jump?
Um, um, which is like a dude. This dude, I think his name was John Smith, which is like the fakest name ever, right?
The
Um,
most American.
he's just filming a street, and people pass by, and then he implies that he narrates these people, right? He's like, "Oh, the man with the hat, please come by from the left, go through to the right, steady pace," and the person would do that. But it was actually right. He was just filming these passerbys, and then later he would voice over his narration.
Oh, okay.
Also, just a very interesting film and how it later is revealed. But that doesn't have anything to do with Japanese film, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, I was mainly asking because
Yeah.
that then you might say that these Benshi movies were a precursor to the massive cultural phenomenon known as the ghost stories dub.
Mm.
Are you
Yeah,
familiar?
I mean, I thought of it. I don't. I mean, I've seen the first episode of Ghost Stories. Have I? I mean, I've probably seen the dub, right? Like, why would you watch Ghost
I
Stories
don't
and not
think
watch the
anyone who's
dub?
seen Ghost Stories has watched the original version.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Just also for kids dubs, right? In general.
Yeah, that's Benshi all the way, right?
Yeah, that's a good. I should write an essay about that, a term paper or something.
Go ahead.
Okay.
You can read it up in the podcast.
Back on topic.
Yeah.
Between 1904 and 1906, there was a war between Russia and Japan, and during that time, war films became very like popular. Not the narrative war films we know nowadays, but obviously just recordings of war. Um,
That sounds
often,
grim.
yeah, often it was like reenacted because they weren't actually allowed to film on the battlefields very much.
Yeah,
Um,
they get kind of in the way, right?
yeah, yeah.
With
I mean,
pretty
they
big
could,
cameras.
back like the officers are also often like sitting by in the back, right? So they could just film from there, but they weren't often allowed. So it was a lot of uh, reenactment. And what's important about this? Why is this for Japan interesting? Because Japan won. So people were very interested in these heroic tales, right?
Yeah. Wait,
Uh,
which war was this again?
Japan and Russia. I think
Oh,
it's
the
just the
Russo-Japanese war.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, okay. See, you know stuff about history.
I've read Golden Kamuy.
Okay. Um, yeah, so that's just a bit kind of interesting. I read up on that. It doesn't really have much to add, but it's something different from these like Kabuki and Shinpa plays.
Yeah,
In 1908, we had the first founding of the first studio. I couldn't actually find the name of the studio anymore when I looked this up just earlier. But they hired a man called Shozo Makino, who owned a theater or like a cinema theater, right? And told him to make films for him. Shozo Makino, I think, made about 2,000 films.
that's a lot.
That's a lot. He's generally regarded as the father of Japanese cinema, right? Just like it was still a lot of like Shinpa and modern like and Kabuki that he did with like a specific actor who also became like the first um the first star of like actual, like he had like a weird nickname and stuff. Like he was like someone people would go to watch, but it most of those can't be found anymore. We'll
Yeah.
get into that a bit later. I've not actually been able to watch any Shozo Makino films yet, even though he also did like adaptations of the 47 Ronin, which people might know from either the 1940 Kenji Mizoguchi film, which is like 3 hours long, or I think in 2010 or something there was an adaptation with Keanu Reeves.
Oh,
There's been like so many stories of like this one story, the 47 Ronin. I think Shozo Makino made the first film about that.
yeah.
He actually
Maybe
made like
that's the next podcast episode.
the English one, like the Keanu Reeves one, is apparently really bad, like really really bad. But
Never mind then.
Keanu Reeves, who doesn't love him? Um, so that's 1908 to like 1913. Like I don't actually remember how long Makino made films, but in 1913 there was a dude who, or like generally there was a movement towards something called Jun Eigageki, which roughly translates to pure cinema. So Japanese cinema was mostly these recordings of like kabuki, or they were very much in the style of kabuki, right? And
Yeah.
they wanted to westernize Japanese cinema.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you this actually. On a more global scale, while Japan was doing these things, did it look different in the rest of the world? Like,
So
have they reached the conclusion that you can add a narrative story to the films yet? Or
yeah, that was like early on. Like 1905 was like 1895 to 1905 is about where we talk about the cinema of attractions, which is like cinema doesn't have a narrative yet. It's the pure spectacle of moving pictures that has people watch films, right?
yeah,
So you have a lot of like just people performing circus tricks or something, and people watch it because it is a moving picture, not because of what is happening in the moving picture.
yeah. I mean, it would be an
Yeah,
amazing
of
experience.
course, right? Like virtual reality games have like a similar, or like maybe they are apart away from that already, but like a lot of things are just, yeah, this is VR. This is like cool because it's VR, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And now 1905 is about where we start with the narrative cinema. So Japan is always just like a bit behind, like maybe a year behind on Western things, because America has a lot of influence onto Japan, right? Also
Yeah.
need to remember that Japan opened its borders to the US or to the world in like 1860. So like 30 years before the before movies were introduced. And it's still, right, like there's still so much new stuff coming in from the US.
Oh
And
yeah, they're having a bit of a craze at the moment.
yeah, and an interesting thing I thought was like films in Japan. So domestically, between 1920 and 1925, domestic films made in Japan increased tenfold. There were by 1925 there were 10 times as many Japanese films produced per year than in 1920. Foreign
Oh
film
wow.
was only 3 times as much imported to Japan. So 3 times as much in 1925 compared to 1920. The thing is, there was still more foreign film, right? Like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah,
just like,
obviously. There's a lot of countries.
yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, it's still mostly American. Right? Back then, it was still a lot of French and German, but French, Germany, and the US are like the big countries back then. Russia actually as well, right? In 1920, then we already had Russian film.
Yeah.
But yeah, so back to the pure cinema, to Jun Egageki.
Yeah, of course.
So 1913, that started. They wanted to westernize. They wanted to make film its own art form, right? Because Japanese film was just theater, basically. So they wanted to Europeanize film by um, stopping to adapt just theater. They wanted to make acting more natural. We noticed this is like a common criticism of modern Japanese film as well. Japanese film is very overacted, right?
Yeah,
Because it has its roots in theater, and in theater you overact because people cannot see your face so close that they can read your expressions, which is something that cinema can do, right? We have close-ups.
yeah, of course.
And so they wanted a more natural thing, and they also wanted to actually have actresses because in Kabuki, men played female roles, right?
Yeah.
They didn't actually have female actresses, so they wanted to do that. That started. So 1913 is when we move more towards what would commonly be called film nowadays. Uh, in 1912, we had an interesting thing where like crime thrillers from France were imported and I think also filmed in a similar stuff in a similar style, and people actually reenacted the crimes from them.
Oh,
Young people did that, so they were fairly impressionable by this cool like European thing, right? And
yeah.
that's when like making those films or like importing those films was forbidden. In it was prohibited in Japan, and that's where we start with censorship. Japan has a long history with censorship in film. uh, Nowadays not anymore, of course, but we go well into like the Second World War. And after the Second World War, the American occupation like stopped Japanese censorship laws but implemented their own, which were way better. But this is where we start, right? In 1925, we had a central censorship office for Japan. So then we had like one place that says what films get made, what films get cut, what films do not get made at all. This is also a more interesting topic when we get to the Second World War. So in another podcast.
Yeah.
Um, so that's mostly the stuff that happens in the 1910s, right? We have like this movement towards European film. We have like the Japanese censorship that starts, and just like this general development. Um, I think in the US and everywhere, the 1910s were also not that interesting, right? It wasn't a time marked by like innovation and everything. It was just like film stabilizing. In
Yeah.
19,
I mean, you need those parts
yeah,
too,
yeah,
right? Where you
def-
just put out content.
definitely. Like if you just look at like between like 1900 and 1930, how much happens in film, it's like fascinating. So like having like 10 years where not that much direct stuff happens is fascinating. But yeah, it's back then everything was simpler and the movement didn't need like 10 years to like stabilize, right? So you
Yeah.
could just have times. um
You mentioned the censorship office.
mhm.
Uh, were there any like common themes that they were interested in censoring, or was it just a case by case basis?
No, there was definitely like things weren't allowed to get too European or like
Oh, it was
Western, right?
European specifically.
That was a lot, right? Like we know that Japan has a weird relationship with like displaying romance, right? So
Yeah,
it was a very Western thing. Like back then, Hollywood also had its code of like what films get produced and what not. So it was all like, no kiss only on the lips, no tongue, and like only married people and stuff. But it was still more um,
it was scandalous.
yeah, but like in Japan, that was like even harder than what they would show, right? Like, so they were like, okay, we can't like have our like young teenagers like make out, right? Well, make out, kiss each other on the lips. That's
Yeah,
scandalous. So it was a lot of this, right? Obviously, no slander against Japan, right? Be, uh, you couldn't complain about the emperor or anything. Um, and yeah, that's just basically it.
okay.
So in 1921, the Great Kanto earthquake happened. This was like a mass. I don't actually know the amount of casualties, but in the history of Japan, in like modern history of Japan, it's always like mentioned as probably the most impactful event. What's the influence on film? There are two major things. For one, as I mentioned before, a lot of Shozo Makino films or generally early film can't be found anymore because film reels are very flammable.
That's
Now,
true.
now you have like a massive earthquake with like, um, like everything caving in and stuff. Basically, so much Japanese film was destroyed. And back then, that was anywhere in the world. Film wasn't like made for future generations, right? It was very much still seen as like a thing, like normal entertainment that you don't need to think back on. So, there weren't like archives that would protect these films.
Yeah.
So that's just like 1920. Finding films before 1921 is hard. I've had to learn this the hard way. I don't have like the perfect sources, of course, but on the internet you're not particularly in like good. It's not easy to find those films.
Yeah. Things being lost to history is a common
Yeah,
sadness in my life.
yeah, that's we honestly like just I mean we have a modern thing with like games that are only available online, right? And like
Oh yeah, should we get into
so,
that?
probably not. Probably not, but it's a common
Hey,
theme even nowadays.
listeners, what do you think happens if you buy a movie on a streaming service and it goes bankrupt?
Yeah. um so where we oh yeah, the Kanto earthquake, right? But the other thing about the Kanto earthquake is obviously that people were very depressed afterwards. And what do you do when you are depressed? You go to the movies.
That's
So
not what I was gonna say, but yeah.
so what, as I mentioned before, like just production of domestic films increased tenfold between 1920 and 1925. So people like that was actually like good for the future film industry, right? Because it just like really gave this incentive to make more films. And in 1925 then we had the early start of sound film. Generally, 1930 is when we like consider commercial sound film to be a thing. Japan apparently had like they showed some that was very rough. There were different systems that were tried out, like how to store sound on the film reel.
Yeah.
But I don't actually know that much about like camera technique and stuff. So um,
You haven't taken that course yet.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's complicated. Like sometimes we have
There's an on button, there's a lens.
yeah we sometimes have co-students talking about the different kinds of lenses that are used, and I'm like, what?
Well,
Right. I
sometimes you put a long lens on if you want to shoot something far away.
mm, yeah, I can recognize a fish lens, and that's it.
That's good.
um yeah, so 1925 that started, and now we have like a big problem for Banshee, because if there's sound film you don't need a narrator, right?
That's true.
There was
Is this where they invent dubbing?
not yet. That this is where a lot of people lose their lives.
Oh, that's sad.
Well, first they lose their jobs. One story I know actually about a former Banshee who committed suicide is Akira Kurosawa's brother, who just couldn't deal with that. And this is something we'll talk about in more depth when we go to Kurosawa, because that actually influences Kurosawa's work.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean that actually that's in line with what I had in mind, because when you said what do people do when they're sad, I almost said kill themselves.
well, sadly, it is sometimes true.
Yeah,
Um,
unfortunate.
yeah. So then, I mean, like we had similar problems in the US where actors would now have to talk, but we had like actors, like stars, actual stars who had specific stereotypical roles that they played, right? Like a cool dude or something, and then you actually
Yeah,
and then you actually hear his voice, and it's like really squeaky. What do you do? Like you can't have this person do that role anymore. Um,
that's
so
true.
so like a lot of actors for silent films also lost their jobs or like had to adapt. um, Dancing in the Rain, the very famous musical, is actually a film about that, about like this adaptation to sound film.
Oh, I haven't watched that.
Yeah, it's great. It's a lot of fun. Just that's in the West. In Japan, I nobody seems to talk about that. Like the Banshee dilemma seems to be much bigger for them. Like in all the books I've read,
Yeah.
though I don't actually know how much they talk in Japanese films in general. Because if you think about like classical Japanese behavior, there's probably less talking than in like Hollywood films.
I am inclined to agree, and that I have nothing against the great nation of Japan. Um, Full
they
disclaimer.
they hold back more, right? Like obviously they were
Yeah.
also they were
I mean,
also Western.
there's obviously cultural differences
Mm.
in every nation on the world, right? In Sweden,
Yeah.
we stand 15 feet apart at the bus stop.
There's there were obviously also Western films where you don't have to talk much, right? Slapstick comedy is a big thing.
Yeah.
You had like these instead of the Banshee in Western film, you had the what do you call them? Just like slides with the text what was said, right? Just like inserts of things people say, and there's some.
Oh, yeah, like Chaplin movies.
Yeah, exactly. And then, for example, Keaton was always an opponent of those. He said, if you can tell your story without it, without these slides, then you do it without them. And if you have to use them and it doesn't work, then you just don't do the scene.
God, film people are so pretentious.
Buster Keaton is great, though. Like, Buster Keaton is way more fun than Chaplin, but that's my own.
I mean,
option.
I'm sure there's a lot of merit to it, right?
I
Like
mean,
it's show don't tell, right? It's
yeah,
an age-old
yeah,
adage. It
yeah.
just sounds so pretentious when it's
It
said with
is.
such
Yeah.
confidence.
It is. I mean, those are. I mean, it's like there are very different styles in Chaplin and Keaton, right? And like obviously, Chaplin is the more well-known one, right?
Yeah,
Like not that Buster Keaton isn't well-known, but
I
compared
hadn't
to
heard of him
Chaplin,
actually.
you should check out some of his films. I'll tell you about them probably some other time. Buster Keaton is like very good slapstick humor,
Oh,
um,
that's nice.
while Chaplin was obviously at one point probably the most famous person in media in the world.
Yeah,
Uh,
that seems about right. Um, just before we move on anymore, now that we've brought Chaplin into this, did Japan have any like? Did they join that wave? Did they have any response to Chaplin's silent movie comedies?
Yeah, definitely. They got highly influenced by that. There's actually, I forgot the name because I didn't write down any names for this really. But there was a Japanese director who actually went to Hollywood to like work with Chaplin, and then
Oh, nice.
later he returned to Japan and like basically brought in what he knew. There's a lot of like influences in the 20s by like Western things, like the expressionism that is found in German works around the time a lot. Um, had some influence there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they definitely take what they can. I don't. I think was that Ernst Lubitsch. I think yeah, that's one. That's the one we had in Noble Watch. I don't know if you were there for To Be or Not to Be.
Oh no, I wasn't.
Okay, I wasn't either, so I can't actually talk that much about it. But
Yeah.
Ernst Lubitsch was like a popular German director who made films in America, and I've read also some influences of his work in Japanese film. So yeah, we take a lot from like Germany um, and the US. I'd be interested if like the influence in like from like German films, if that was big enough to influence like how society sees like the Second World War stuff, right?
Oh
Because
yeah,
obviously
maybe.
Japan and Germany being allies, whether like the idea of German films having a place in society, in Japanese society, whether that opened up general citizens to the idea of allying up with Germany. But that's like a big like
That's
socio-politic topic. That's
yeah,
nothing.
that's an undertaking, but it sure would be interesting to hear about.
Um,
Definitely. I guess for the record, we mentioned it. I don't think we mentioned it yet on the podcast. Nobu Watch is a group watch.
oh, that is true. We did not talk
Yeah,
about that. Yeah.
that Asuka started up. We have a couple solid members. We're always open to applicants. Currently, we're at 2 movies a week.
Mm.
I don't think there's a lot of interest in going up to any movies above that.
Mm. Well, once we get more people, maybe. Right, I've got some
Maybe.
ideas, but um, yeah, we also do want to at some point talk a bit about the films we watch there. Whether it's because I watch most of the films, whether it's me explaining to Carl and the audience what's exciting about these films,
Yeah.
or whether we just discuss those films if we both watch them and like them a lot, like we did with Suspiria, which we didn't watch as part of the Nobu watch, but yeah.
Yeah. So that's definitely going to play a part in subsequent podcast episodes.
Yes. Yeah, so this is also like approximately where we end, right? Like, so in 1930, we had like the big American breakthrough of sound film. And in 1931, the first like American sound films came to Japan and also had like a big breakthrough. And generally in the whole world, by 1933, we did not have silent films anymore, right? They were not produced anymore.
Yeah. That's an interesting thing in general. This isn't related to Japan specifically, but more like movies in general. I feel like a lot of movie art forms have remained in some kind even after they've gone out of fashion, right? As
Mm,
like artistic touches, right?
yeah.
But no one makes silent movies anymore.
Yeah, it's
Is that
even
ever talked about?
yeah, definitely. Like it's surprising how fast that goes, especially if you compare it with color film, right? Color film, I forgot when it was introduced, but I think it must have started popping up in like the 40s, maybe like the early 50s. But filmmakers still made black and white films well into the 60s and maybe even 70s, right? Like there was an artistic choice to go for black or black and white over color.
Yeah.
Well, nobody would like. Again, it took 2 years, and silent films we had just not produced anymore. And these 2 years were mostly like, did the studio have enough money to like get sound equipment? Like, were they like making deals with any sound production companies, and were they mastering those techniques?
Yeah. I guess from the audience standpoint, I guess there would be a lot of appeal. Just like there was appeal to see moving pictures, there would
Mm.
probably be a lot of appeal to see moving pictures with sound,
Yeah, with people
right?
actually talking, right?
Yeah, yeah. I can hear this American person, right? Right. A lot
Yeah,
of these people had probably never even seen an American before in their lives, uh, or a European for that matter, right?
yeah.
Uh, Not everyone went on vacation that far away. And then, like, I guess black, white, and color. There's obviously a big difference, but you still see the same things, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, not.
I just think it's interesting that
I,
silent movies haven't made a comeback of any kind, right? Like a
mm,
lot of movies in modern day, they either have scenes in partly black and white for like visual aesthetic, or they do crazy high contrast, which almost gives the same kind of impression, right?
mm. I mean, we do have like again, as you said, like I don't do disagree that like black and white and color film is like fundamentally the same because you can do like a lot of differences and
No, I mean
ultimately,
they're not
yeah,
fundamentally the same. I mean to the layman, right?
mm,
Who just watches movies as a way to blow off steam
true,
after the great Kanto earthquake.
yeah.
They probably would be like, I still see the people moving, right?
Mm. So I mean, we also do sometimes have like sections of a film without sound, right? But I agree that that's not the same as like a silent film.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's more of like silent film feels like an art form in itself that's
yeah,
been lost to time.
definitely, definitely. Um,
The limited amount of silent film I've seen during my school days.
Yeah, I mean, if you see these like regular narrative films that also like use slides a lot to have text on and stuff, I completely understand why, because these films are not as exciting as like what you can do with modern film, right? It's generally restricted film, like slapstick films and stuff. Being silent does something for these films, right? You don't
Yeah.
need text sound, but if you have like talking and you don't show it, it generally feels like an incomplete art form.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I feel like it would be interesting if it did make some sort of comeback, though. Although I say that, it's probably been tried a lot of times
Yeah, probably.
and never taken off, right?
Yeah, I
It's
mean,
more like I'd be interested to see how those restrictions you were talking about, how they could breed creativity, right?
yeah,
With the addition of the more evolved knowledge of movie as an art form that we have nowadays.
yeah, yeah. I mean, right, black and white films sometimes get their revival. The Lighthouse came out in 2019.
Oh yeah, I still have to see that.
Yeah, it's a film, sure.
Yeah, I mean,
um,
I do love when you see modern cinema either take influences or pay homage
I
to
I was
older
expect
art forms.
I was expecting you to say I do love to see Willem Dafoe's ass, because that is a thing that you see in that film.
I haven't seen Willem Dafoe's ass, so I
Well,
wouldn't know.
you
But
should watch The Lighthouse, then you will see Willem Dafoe's ass.
don't tempt me with a good time.
What's the other guy's name? The one who played the vampire in Twilight? Robert
Oh,
Pattinson? No.
yeah,
Yeah?
yeah, yeah.
This-
That's his name, Robert Pattinson. He's
Sadly, you don't see his ass.
that's unfortunate.
It's
Maybe they
probably a
showed
way
that
more
in
attractive ass than Willem
yeah.
Dafoe's.
Maybe they showed that in Twilight though.
Maybe they do.
Yeah, Robert Pattinson. He belongs to that specific group of actor that's really good, but they got cast in bad movies, so no one
Yeah.
respects them.
He'll never live that down.
Yeah,
He,
like
he-
oh, what's the girl who you've definitely not seen 50 Shades of Grey, but
I
the
have
girl in
not.
50 Shades of Grey is a surprisingly good actress
Okay.
who is also in other things that I've seen recently.
Yeah.
I'll look it up after the
Yeah.
podcast.
Yeah. So I think we can like talk about like black and white films at some point as well, or something. But you know,
Yeah, definitely.
that's a bit like big for this podcast again as well.
Yeah.
Um,
But I mean, I guess like this is going to be a fairly common occurrence. I think you
yeah. I mean,
talking about like more academical knowledge of movies.
yeah.
I feel like that's something unique that our podcast can probably bring, seeing as we have the asset of a film student.
Yeah. Also, just when I write like essays or term papers, I'm probably like gonna bring this into here to talk about that, right?
Yeah,
The
and
problem is, of course, I write them in German, so I can't just hand them to you, so you can read them in preparation. But
well, I do speak German.
but can you read academic term papers?
No.
Okay, so I'll explain them to you, right?
Yeah. I
And
once had an entire conversation with your dad.
crazy.
Yeah.
I haven't. That's a joke.
Oh, that's too real.
Yeah. No. So obviously, also, if like any of the approximately 2 people listening to this podcast at the moment have any interesting topics or stuff, we'll talk about those.
Yeah. And obviously, we're still gonna do more stuff in the vein of the Suspiria one, and we're gonna do more stuff in the vein of the video games one.
Yeah, I mean, we are just called the Currently Unnamed Movie Podcast because we don't have a different name. We're not specifically a
yeah, but then
academic movie
it's
podcast.
also rarely also games, right? It's the Camrag now.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
true. It's true that it is.
Yeah.
Okay, back on topic because we don't actually have much more to Japanese film, and I want to get away from the Camrag. Okay, so we were at the early sound film, and so this is something that I haven't entirely understood yet. So the 1930s is also when like some more famous directors really start working. We have Yasujiro Ozu. He's I think you also went there for the group watch of late spring.
No, I wasn't. I've
Uh,
been really bad at attending.
yeah. So Yasujiro Ozu is probably the second most famous Japanese director after Kurosawa. He made films from like the 30s to the 60s. Most of these like regular people, like family conflicts and stuff. He had a very stationary camera, always like on like sitting height, because in Japan they have these like usually these low tables where they would sit for tea, right? So it was always at the height of these tables to be on like the same level as everyone who's sitting there and then talking. They are very slow films, very good, but very slow. Often about like generational conflicts, right? Like children who don't really care about their parents and stuff, and like how the parents deal with that.
Yeah, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, he started in the 30s. We have Kenji Mizoguchi, who I don't actually have a real clue what kind of films Mizoguchi makes. I think he made films, especially historic films, about like the early Heian period, which is like around the year 800, right? So long before samurai, even, but more
Oh
like
yeah.
these historic dramas. Generally, what's also important to note, I will go into more depth in this. In in the West, we have like general distinctions between genres, right? Like between horror
Yes,
and comedy and stuff.
we absolutely
Recurring
do that.
trope. In Japan, the main distinction, like we still, of course, have that, especially also because of the Western influence. But the main distinction is between jidaigeki and gendaigeki. Um, jidaigeki are period dramas, and gendaigeki are contemporary films, right? So the main distinction in genres in Japanese film is, does it play in the present or in the past?
Oh, okay.
Which is fairly interesting, right? So like um you can remember which is which because like samurai films are pretty much obviously jidaigeki, they are set in the past, and that sounds like Jedi. And the Jedi in Star Wars are basically the samurai
They are
of the
samurai.
Star Wars
Yeah,
thing, right, of the Star Wars universe. So that's jidaigeki is the. I have always had trouble like remembering which is which until my prof said exactly this. Jedi are samurai, so jidaigeki is samurai films and other films set in the past.
sure. Do they still use these terms?
Yes,
Oh,
there
really?
there are
Do they have another term for movies set in the future?
not really. I think that those would also be like if you were to look at something like Star Wars or Star Trek, right, which is like very far removed from our society.
Yeah,
I don't actually think Japan has that many of those. Right? It's not that
that's true.
big of a
Uh,
thing. There's
I don't
even
think I've heard of a lot of like Japanese sci-fi movies in general. I mean,
and
if we want to go into anime as well, there's obviously like Cowboy Bebop and
mm,
Space Dandy and
yeah, if we go into film specifically, the only thing that comes to mind instantly is the Polygon Godzilla trilogy. Those are also animated by it, right? They are like far away space sci-fi.
yeah.
The three animated films that are on Netflix.
I feel like kaiju movies are honorary sci-fi.
Well, I mean, they are sci-fi, right? But they are set in our society, right? It's more like something like Steins Gate. It's definitely sci-fi, but it's sci-fi in
Yeah,
a
it's
relatable
modern
society.
day sci-fi.
Yeah, exactly. So while something like Star Trek, which isn't possible nowadays and would not be possible at all ever, probably, or like nowadays, Japan just doesn't have that. Like, of course they have, but not enough to have a term on like the same level as Jidaigeki and Gendaigeki.
Yeah, that makes sense. I
Yeah, and
mean,
then
that's something you don't really think about. It's like massive cultural phenomenon
yeah,
or phenomena, I guess is the plural term that we have in our part of the world. Probably don't like make a ripple at all
mm.
over there.
Yeah. I mean, it is a very Americanized society nowadays,
Yeah,
right?
but I mean, on the other hand, like over there, like everyone knows Doraemon and Anpanman and
That's true.
all of these figures, and I don't think I could find 3 people in my city that knows.
Yeah. Um, so you obviously also have like further distinctions in like Jidaigeki set in the past. You have like Chanbara, which are like sword action films, right? Which would also include Ronin and samurai films, but not, for example, most. I think like any of the Mizoguchi films, who was more like about merchants and stuff, right? Um,
Oh, that sounds interesting, actually.
yeah, there's I think his most well known. It's a bit later, but it's from the 50s. It's Sancho the Bailiff. It's about like a government official who gets exiled because he's too good to his people, right? Like he refuses um to like collect taxes that would like hurt the people there because they don't have that much. So he gets like transferred elsewhere, right? Like basically exiled.
Yeah.
And on the journey there, they get attacked. Or well, he goes there, and his family is to follow after. And then we follow his family following, like his mother, his wife, and his daughter and his son, both fairly young, and they get attacked by bandits. And basically, the mother's sold off somewhere as a slave, and the siblings are still together, but also like sold off into slavery. And then we follow them as they grow up, the kids, and later as they try to escape and like reunite with their family. It's a really good film.
Oh, interesting.
And then later, like I've not seen all of this, but The Crucified Lovers is a film about like just people were like, I think they work as like calendar makers, right? And like basically this one employee who's like really good at his job there falls in love with his boss's wife, and then just them trying to elope and stuff like that.
Yeah, that
But,
happened to me
but
once.
okay. Um, so that's what Mizoguchi is known for. These like Heian era and like early, like long before samurai. These films. He also did some contemporary films, I think. Ozu is known only for contemporary films, so we've already talked about it. And then the third, like big one, who also went well into the 50s and 60s, is Mikio Naruse. He also did like these um, contemporary dramas, often featuring female leads. Also, very good films, partially like more about like female leads struggling in like patriarchal society and stuff like that. Very interesting.
Oh, that's how early was this?
This was also from like the 30s to like the 50s. I don't know how much he did in the 30s. The only things I've seen are from the 50s as well.
Oh wow, surprisingly
But yeah,
progressive.
yeah.
Bonus points.
Um, so what I don't understand about this all is that Akira Kurosawa has in an interview called the time around like 36 and 37. He called this the first golden age of Japanese cinema, where directors like Ozu, like Mizoguchi, like Naruse could make any films they want, and the studios would just be like, "Yeah, here's your money, go make that film." But there was still censorship in place, so I'm a bit like confused about how much. And like, if you look at the films, you don't really see like the same mass and like historical relevance for these films like in the second golden age, which was the 50s, where
Yeah.
these directors were also still active.
Well, I guess like from a purely cultural aspect, like do you know how like Japanese filmmakers look back on the censorship? Like
Um,
do they despise it or
I mean, I've seen an interview with Akira Kurosawa, who started during the Second World War.
yeah.
With like he had his directorial debut in 1941, and he didn't really like the censorship. He talked about it in excess that like
Oh,
it was very restricting.
but he still called it the golden age.
Yeah, before he worked, when he was still like an assistant director.
Yeah.
It seems like maybe it is just that he got like that back then the topics they want weren't like worth to censor, and then they were like, okay, yeah, we can let like some of this through, maybe. He did also say that in like the interview was from the late 80s, maybe early 90s. So maybe he said this also in comparison to nowadays, because he also said that like after the 70s, 80s, and 90s, in that area, that that there's this culture of like directors have to be thankful to studios and to producers, right? It's like this:
Oh,
you work for us, and like you can be glad that you get to make this film. Well, obviously, the directors are the people making money for the studio, right? You don't you don't need
well,
to thank the studio for giving you a job when you're making, like, when your thank is already the movie, but it's like, oh, you're indebted to us, right? You owe us something for letting you make that movie. So maybe
yeah,
it's in
well,
contrast to that.
that just feeds into the larger narrative of capitalism, right?
Yeah, yeah. So maybe Kurosawa just talked about this in contrast to that. But 1936, 1937, the years before Japan joined the Second World War, that's um, what's generally considered the first golden age of Japanese film.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And that is
Yeah,
also where we'll finish with this for now. So we're just before the Second World War. Next time, if we talk about this, we're going to talk about the Second World War more extensively and the first golden age, 50s, 60s.
yeah.
And
So
I think that's,
homework is to watch all these movies.
yeah.
I'm not going to do it. Um,
You should watch the short ones at least, right?
yeah, yeah. I can probably check out the short ones, but never expect anything from me. Um, I took some notes, or at least I took some notes in the beginning before I realized I couldn't pay attention at the same time, which
Mm,
is how it usually goes when I try to take notes on something. The notes I took was the first one is workers leaving factory, French, 1985, and then I took
1890,
yeah,
1859, no,
that's a
1895. Yeah.
misclick on my
Okay.
part. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, the next one, and it spirals pretty early. It says Edison got cucked in all caps.
That, yeah, yeah, that
Yeah,
makes
and
sense.
then it ends.
That's
That's my
that's
notes.
that's where you. I'm looking at my notes I'd made earlier. I forgot one interesting thing.
Yeah.
There was about like 1917 that started until like 1925. They tried this. Was a thing called Rensageki. This was a mix between theater and film. Basically, you had these shimpa pieces, this modern contemporary kabuki, and scenes you could not play on stage were like projected onto a screen. Right, they were pre-recorded and like projected onto a screen, and then you would have the actors who are in the theater would like voice over them, which is just like an interesting idea. The problem is that just for fire safety reasons, nobody really ever got allowed to do this, right? Because like theaters weren't allowed to like project film, because again, film reels are highly flammable,
Yeah.
and like cinemas, I think, were not allowed to like have actors on like a stage or something, or like maybe it was like, you know, requisites and stuff that they weren't allowed to use. So basically, it was just like, it's a really cool idea, but it never, you know, it never caught on just because fire hazard stuff.
Well, maybe there's room for that now.
I mean, nowadays they're still bad with fire. Well, not they, but funny anecdote. There's this story of a airport in Berlin that I feel like has been relevant. Like it's probably not relevant anymore. I don't know what they did with it, but I think that started in like 2005 or 2010, where they started building it, and they forgot to build in a fire exit or
Oh,
something.
I mean that's just Germans.
Yeah, and the thing was already mostly built. So for years it was always like, you know, here's a new draft of what we can still do. No, that's not good enough. I think at some point they wanted to like repurpose it into like a skate park, but like rich people obviously say no for like cool ideas like a public skate park, right?
Yeah, we hate kids.
Yeah. So that's just like a small anecdote about fire safety.
Yeah.
Nobody's good at it.
Do you think they forgot, or do you think they tried to prank the good people of Germany?
I think they just like were like, okay, yeah, now that we just leave that there as is and never talk about it again. Right? It's
Yeah,
definitely
that's
not.
what I would have done.
It's definitely still not an airport. Um, I think like I obviously I live as far away from Berlin as humanly possible in Germany, which is not far enough. No, that's a joke. I love Berlin, so I don't know that much.
You're legally obligated to say that.
Yes, otherwise our podcast gets censored by the Berlin censorship office.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, no. So that's just a funny anecdote because we're done with Japanese film history. So, um,
Yeah.
yes, is there any other like stuff left over that you have in questions or stuff?
I do have a couple questions that I like. If you know the answer to them, you can provide them.
Sure.
Um, we talked a bit about like Japan taking influence from other countries. Do you know if there's any significant, at this time happenings of Japan influencing um, like cinema on a global level, or were they more like
Absolutely none of that.
no
Japanese,
one fucking watched it?
no one in the US or elsewhere watched it. Japan got its international breakthrough in 1950 with Akira Kurosawa's film Rashomon. This is a very important film again because like that opened up.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, it's it's like for film students who are not interested in Japanese film, it's the most important Japanese film, right next to Seven Samurai, also by Kurosawa.
Yeah, it's like Fight Club, but for Japan.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Film students would kill you now, probably, like calling Fight Club a historically irrelevant film. Uh, yeah.
Isn't it though? Like
Eh,
objectively speaking,
no, not
the last 50 years is also history. The last
first.
30 years is history.
Yeah, Fight Club is 30 years old in a
Yeah,
few
but
years.
I mean that's in
Um,
the 50-year span.
that's true. That's a whole like other can of beans. Like when does history end, and like when can we actually track influencers and stuff, and whether Fight Club is actually like noteworthy in that sense that it is actually the first film that did something, and not just a film that
Fight Club
is
was the first film.
right after Face Off, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. So no, Japanese film did not have any relevance to like the wider world until 1950.
Oh, okay. That's good to know, actually.
Yeah, yeah. It's
They
we're
were in
growing.
their little bubble, and they kind of just fucked around and did their own thing.
Yeah,
For a
we'll
bit.
get into how 1950 changed that a bit more in like a Kurosawa podcast, which is like genuinely like Kurosawa is a genuinely interesting filmmaker who makes very entertaining films. So we should definitely talk about him sometime.
Yeah, I'm sure of it. Um, Also, I had better questions earlier, but then I forgot them in the in the whatever we've been doing. Um, like at what point, like, and this is, I guess, more of a global question as well. But at what point did movies and cinema in itself start developing like proper movie stars, right? Like
Mm.
famous actresses and actors.
Yeah. So the in Hollywood, Charlie Chaplin is called the first movie
Yeah,
star,
obviously.
right? So he started doing films in like what 1910 maybe.
Yeah, he popularized the toothbrush mustache only to
Mm.
be uh,
Kacked by Adolf Hitler.
a couple years later.
Um, yeah. So we had like as soon as narrative cinema started in like the 1910s, I think that's like where stars were also a big thing. Like um I forgot all their names because I don't really find US Hollywood stars that interesting.
I mean, names are hard in general.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, Japan as well. Like Shozo Makino in 1908, he had like a specific actor with whom he did a lot of films. Um, so he was a big star. And we obviously had these Banshee, as I mentioned before, who could be considered stars, even though they weren't on the film.
Yeah.
Yep. So actually, like 1910, I'd say is like when actually narrative cinema had some stuff that it could do. When you could in the US, you could be very racist on film and like tell a very racist story.
Some argue that you still can do that.
Yeah, that is true. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Um,
then I guess the last big question I have is you mentioned the early Japanese cinema as being primarily French driven.
mhm.
During this like era of Japanese film history, are there any more like big examples of co-productions internationally? You mentioned there was a guy who went to visit Chaplin for a bit.
Mhm.
Were there any like on a global level, any co-productions, or was that not a thing in general yet?
It was like rarer than nowadays, even though Japanese, American, or like French co-productions are still a big thing. It's so we had went to work with Chaplin. We had like obviously then the Lumiere films, even though they were more like French produced films in Japan, right?
Yeah.
What's important is that these early Lumiere films were also made in Japan to be sent back to France as well, right?
Yeah.
There were definitely influences from Germany, but I think not that many co-productions. Germany was already in the 20s. It was already stopping to be relevant because as soon as the Nazis started taking over, all the Jewish filmmakers left.
I wonder why.
Yeah, and like generally, right? Like this is a later thing, but German censorship was just like the people were just, I'm not gonna fuck with that, and then they went to the US, and Germany has never recovered since. Like this is also an interesting thing for the future. But after the Second World War, Germany just didn't have a film industry anymore,
Oh,
and
really?
yeah, like they made.
I mean,
they,
I guess there were a lot of things they didn't have anymore.
Yeah, I mean, but they didn't even really try to build up, right? Still made films, but they made these like home films. They are called, and they
Oh,
are
okay.
creatively bankrupt, right? It's really just the biggest idea is that we just want these people to not think about anything, right? That those kind of romances and stuff.
Oh, okay.
Back in the late 40s and early 50s. And Japan, on the other hand, like really built up again, right? It was like, okay, the people are depressed because we just lost a war. We are occupied by the US, but we're also not as hardly censored as strictly censored anymore. So we're just gonna make films because these people want to they want to get entertained.
Yeah. I mean, I would argue Japan more than lost the war.
I mean, yeah. I mean, there's definitely also a difference in like how these societies like interact with losing the war, right? Like,
Yeah.
of course, Japan has the nuclear bombs, right? Big
Yeah.
thing, and obviously, I think like it could be that a big part of why Japan doesn't talk about much about the Second World War is because of the American occupation and the censorship. Right, that I don't know if this is actually true, but I have this idea that the Americans were like, you don't have to talk about the atomic bombs that much because they were an American thing, and like, sure, the Americans didn't see that as like an atrocity what they did, right? In the eyes of the US back then, this was like a justified attack or
I mean,
defense,
in
even.
the eyes of the US nowadays as well, they still try to
Yeah.
justify it. So.
So Japan doesn't really like talk about the Second World War as much, right? They don't reflect on that at all.
Yeah.
There's like an interesting anecdote. My prof in the Kurosawa seminar also told me he went to Japan with a colleague, and they went to like a museum, and in that museum they had like the swastika and stuff displayed, right? And they were like these Japanese guys and everything. They were like kind of like, yeah, don't you remember how we worked together, right?
Yeah, that's actually like because obviously, it's not a ground that you can build a real basis of an
Mm.
argument upon, but I feel like every other week, another mangaka comes out as being like extremely
Yeah,
pro-imperialist Nazi supporter.
yeah. And in Germany, this is unimaginable. In Germany, we
Yeah, Germany is very much ashamed of their past in
yeah,
that aspect,
from the start we are educated to hate the German flag. It's, I
as
mean,
it
this is
should be.
like the only moment when you get to be like a rampant nationalist is when the World Cup is on in soccer.
Yeah.
Then you get to like, I don't want to say basically be a Nazi, but you know, I have my opinions on soccer. Uh,
You, yeah. Let's leave it at that.
yeah. So yeah, that's just interesting, and I wonder if the American censorship has anything to do with that. That they were like, you know, because the U.S. were obviously like fairly interlinked with Japan, because Japan didn't really do a war against anyone but like the US. Well, I mean Manchuria, right? China,
Yeah.
Japan, as China and Russia as well. But I think like the whole Pearl Harbor thing and then the atomic bombs. That's like still the biggest part of Japanese war of the World War
Yeah.
II.
It's a doozy.
Yeah.
The atomic bombs and that part of World War II is one of the bits of history that I uh, do feel a bit more knowledgeable about, simply
Mm,
because I think it's such a nuanced thing that
yeah.
um, people kind of owe it to themselves to be more educated on it, so they don't succumb to propaganda, right?
Yeah.
Um, Especially in the digital age. And it really just illustrates to me, and I say this with the deepest of respect for the island nation, but Japan is a very strange place, like culturally primarily.
Yeah.
Obviously, I don't know exactly how it is now. I've never been there, but especially during that period of time, there was. It's all very strange to me when a nation cares so much about their ruling
Mm,
power, ruling entity, the emperor in this case, that they genuinely don't think they would be able to handle themselves without him.
yeah.
And I think that like that general mental state in it's easy for it to succumb to all sorts of rationalizations and just not good stuff in
Mm,
general.
yeah. But that's history, not movies, right? Not movie
Yeah,
history. So we don't really want to go like any deeper into it, I
yeah.
think.
It's
Right.
also like I don't think people listen to this.
Hey.
I don't think people listen to this, but I especially don't think people listen to this to hear me talk about uh, counter arguments to the justifications of the nuclear bombings, one of the world's
Mm.
greatest atrocities in history. Um, I could do that
Well, another time.
another time.
Another time, another place. So I think that's also it for the questions you had.
Yeah, I think so.
Right.
This was really interesting.
I'm happy about that.
I very much understand why you can study this as a subject.
Mm,
I mean, everything involving history in general can be so interesting because it's the butterfly effect is so rampant,
yeah.
right? This happened, and then that led to this little thing happening, and then by coincidence, right? This one guy got an idea, and if he hadn't, what
Yeah.
then? If the Lumiere brothers hadn't gone to Japan,
That's
how
true.
different could the entirety of Japanese cinema and even global cinema be?
Yeah. I mean, we do have like a fairly a good comparison to South Korean cinema, right? It's really coming right now, right? Like Parasite winning like all the Oscars
Yeah,
and
uh,
stuff is obviously a big thing. And since the 2000s, it's been like more and more popular. But there basically wasn't a South Korean film industry on that level until like 1995, maybe.
that's
And
very late.
yeah, the South Korean film is very much still in its baby shoes.
Yeah, I'm only 5 years older than South Korean movies.
You mean
Younger,
younger?
young.
Yeah,
Yeah, I haven't slept tonight.
I'm as old as South Korean, like modern South Korean film, right? There were films, but that's like South Korean film. Maybe one day we'll talk about that. It's also like a whole box of worms.
Yeah, I feel like every country, like even the really small ones. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
There's interesting
history is
stuff.
big, right?
Yeah, exactly. Um, so to finish this off, because we've also already been overshooting my goal for the whole film section, we want to do a finishing segment. Usually, this will probably be me talking about a film I watched, like just trying to sell it. I have some really interesting films I want to talk about, but I've talked enough about it. I've talked enough for today. So instead, I let
Yeah,
Carl have completely free reign as to how to finish this podcast off. I don't know what it is. Will you tell us what the fuck you're gonna do?
yeah. So I haven't talked enough this podcast, um, and so here it comes. Um, I am not a movie person in the same vein that Asuka is. I really don't know why I'm part of this podcast, to be honest. No, I know why I'm part of this podcast. It's because I'm a good friend of Asuka's, and because I'm interested in movies, even though I don't study them. And so I was thinking what I could bring to this, and the answer I arrived at was nothing. And so what I'm going to do is basically I'm just going to tell Asuka things that I've been doing recently since
Mhm.
the previous podcast episode, and I'm going to have Asuka rate them on a scale of 1 to 10.
Okay.
How much they are good experiences and how much I have wasted my time.
Hmm.
Um, so I'm going to do that for like a couple things. I don't live that much of an eventful life. And then I'm going to talk about a movie I've seen actually.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's a. I don't know how topical the movie is anymore, but yeah. So, I got interviewed recently.
Oh, what for?
Yeah, it was a friend of the show, Ali.
Ah.
He is studying journalism and he is working on his master's. And little known fact about me is I play a lot of tabletop RPGs.
Mm-hmm.
And so what he's doing right now, and I really hope I have his permission to say this, he's working on a radio documentary
Mm-hmm.
about. Uh, he's been a bit back and forth, I think, on what exactly it's about, but the general gist of it is like people creating stories in the modern age,
Oh,
and
nice.
he's comparing it to an old timey. No, actually, not even old timey. He's comparing it to a guy who lived in the 1900s at some point, who he made his living forging old documents, pretending they were historical documents, and like selling them
Uh,
to newspapers and stuff, or not even documents, like old stories and anecdotes and stuff.
mm.
He was like 19, so a very smart young man who just
Yeah.
forged these most likely very believable stories. He had no proper education, nothing at all like that. And to tie it into the modern times, Ali's well, he basically asked me to interview. He probably asked a couple other people too,
Mm.
um, because obviously I play tabletop, and because I game master tabletop, so I do have some experience in creating stories and characters and stuff like that. So we have had a lovely chat about that.
That's
Um,
yeah, that's really cool.
yeah, it didn't go very well. Or he claims it went well. But it's the thing where like you have an important thing or you talk about something important, and then the next day you're like, I have so much better things I could have said.
I have some history with like doing interviews, right? Like interviewing people.
Oh right.
Just like minor things, but I did interview two of the Gynex of the like, founders of Studio Gynex one day, right?
Right,
who
I remember this. Yeah.
yeah, Hiroyuki Yamaga, and I've already forgot the other one, but like they mostly did production, right? They produced stuff like Gunbuster, and I think there's that weird Gainax anime with the robot maid from like the early 2000s. Yamaga directed that, and he directed Honami's.
Oh, is that Daikon?
No, Daikon.
No.
Daikon is just these shorts, right? That
Yeah.
um, but anyways, I understand that it's like it's intimidating to be interviewed or to be in an interview in general.
Yeah. I
And
mean, like, I'm generally not a bad public speaker.
mm,
Like, this podcast is no issue at all for me, really. But I don't know, something about it. I got so nervous, and he would ask a question,
mm.
and I would start speaking and immediately forget the question, you know? And then I just rambled and I said something that felt good. Um,
Yeah, still that's a very cool experience. Yeah, I don't.
yeah, it made me feel like I was good at something. So
That's
big thank you to Ali for that,
yeah.
for making me feel like a celebrity. How would you rate that on a scale of 1 to 10,
So
Asuka?
the problem is that I need a framework, right? So I could rate this now a 5 and rate everything around it.
Yeah, well, I guess
Uh,
the framework is up to you, right?
right, but for a framework that's up to me, I would rather hear another story, and then I'll rate both.
All right. Well, here's another story. It's a bit shorter.
Mhm.
So the other day, it's not the other day anymore, actually. It's last week. Last weekend, I was at the club. Um, Sweden, this is a side note, this isn't part of the story, but Sweden has actually gotten their head out of their rears, and
Mhm.
now they're doing proof of vaccination to get into clubs and
Mhm.
stuff. So it's been a lot more freeing to go to them and stuff. Just with my friends having a good time. And I'm standing at the bar, and these two very large individuals come up to me, uh, clearly inebriated. They've had a bit to drink. This is towards the end of the night. It's I think it's
Also
one.
important context is that you are very small.
I am very small. I'm a small person. I'm 167 centimeters. Um, yeah, I'm not a big boy.
Mhm.
So I probably have to look up at like a 60-degree angle to see their heads. Um, this is like 1:30 a.m. The club closes at 2. He comes up.
Mhm.
He stands next to me. I've been waiting for maybe 2 minutes for the bartender to have time for me. Uh, he looks at me. He looks back. He does a double take. He goes, "You're cute," and I say, "Yeah, I know." And he says, and I will never forget this. He says, "You look like a Greek god, like Poseidon." And I say, "Yeah, that's natural talent."
Okay, yeah. It's
Yeah.
very obviously that you were also inebriated.
No, this is how I am.
Okay, yeah. I
This is
mean,
my narcissism.
funny
Um,
story about that is like my most recent encounter with like Greek gods is the manga Record of Ragnarok. I don't know if you've heard of it.
I've heard the title,
Okay,
probably.
it's basically representatives of like human history fighting against gods in like a battle tournament, and like
Okay.
it's like 13 rounds, and whoever wins 7, not like if humanity wins 7 rounds, they get to live on. If not, they get eradicated.
Yo,
So
Battle Shonen.
yeah, it's extremely and like extremely everyone's muscular, right? Like there's a lot of like also um of like twinks, right? There's Adam, the original human, um as like one of the representatives for human, and like the second or third person the gods sent in is Poseidon, actually. And he's very like he looks like he's mid 20s but ripped.
Yeah.
uh so yeah, I can see it.
I mean, calling me ripped is a bit of an
No, but
overstatement.
just like the general idea, right? He's
Yeah,
I think he's even supposed to be blonde. So
maybe.
yeah.
I'm not in touch with my Greek mythology. Um, Ragnarok is even Nordic mythology.
Oh yeah,
So.
this manga is also not like just Greek gods. It's like gods
Oh,
from
okay, okay.
all kinds of mythologies and stuff.
Yeah, I was a
So
bit insulted there at the prospect.
yeah, no,
Yeah,
like, yeah.
but no, the story doesn't end there either. So he points to his friend who's standing next to him, and he goes, "This guy has natural talent." And then the bartender comes over and he asks them what they want because obviously they're way larger than me and they bring more attention to themselves. And he goes, "No, you're doing this guy first. He's got natural talent." And yeah, that's the only compliment I've received this year.
that's
Uh,
that's great. I do
yeah,
love it. It's a very nice story. I do like the interview story as well because I love creating stuff and like hearing about creating stuff. But like just big people telling you you're cute and you have natural. Well, you telling them you have natural talent and them believing it. That's good alcohol stories. We've had
yeah. I mean,
too few of those.
I love talking to drunk people,
Mm.
right? Like it's especially like the juxtaposition of this very imposing uh, figure. Yeah,
Um,
it was a good event.
I believe you. So I choose to take the drunk story as the framework. That's a 5, around which we will form every future story.
Yeah,
So 5 out of 10. I like it a lot. It's very funny. And then the interview story gets a 6 in that it's less funny but cool. And I just like hearing about people doing things, but
yeah,
also like
it
funny
is kind
stories.
of cool.
Yeah,
Yeah, there might be a follow up. I'm not entirely sure how it's looking right now, but he was talking about it a bit. He claims his teacher or his professor liked my contribution, but I think it's
nice.
the prospect of having a multicultural
Mm,
having a
that's
multicultural interviewee group.
that's valuable. Yeah. If you
Yeah,
are listening to this, by the way, and you are not Ali, Ali also has the movie podcast that I regularly guested on. It's
that's
been a
true.
bit slower these days, but eccentric cinema cast. I've been on the first and the third episode of it. I think. I think it was the third one. And there's
You
going to
were
be
on there and
more.
talking about Jason Statham for a while.
Yeah, that was the first one.
Living my dream, I might
Exactly.
add.
Um, so, and then about Kashan, one of my favorite Japanese films.
That's true. I haven't listened to that episode yet.
It's
Um,
a bit rambly, but yeah. So you should listen to that if you are not Ali and you listen to this, or you haven't listened to
Even
ECC
if you
yet.
are Ali, you should listen to it. It's
Probably.
good for some self appreciation hours.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And there's
Yeah,
hopefully going to be more content for ECC in the next year, where I will also probably take part because I just like collaborating with people.
yeah. He hasn't had me on yet.
Yeah, I mean,
That's we need to find a proper insane movie for that.
yeah, exactly.
He wasn't there when we watched Turkle. You weren't either.
I wasn't either.
Yeah, that's a good movie. He's also on the Garcast,
Yeah, of course.
which is like our podcast, but they don't upload.
they make just as many cum jokes.
No more.
And they're all very cool people. I was also actually just recently I was on Garcast to talk to Elena about 2 animated films, Mamoru Hosoda's Bell and Summit of the Gods, which is a French animated film adaptation of a Japanese manga as well. So
Yeah, I rate that 3 out of 10 because I
okay,
don't like the French.
that's fair. I mean, I'm German. I can't like the French. Do you have any more stories?
No one can like the French. Um, uh, Not in particular. Those were the big two.
Okay.
I was at a work event
Nope.
the day before yesterday. We had a bit of a Christmas celebration. It's been a good year for my workplace, apparently, despite or in spite of everything. Um, I'm one of the youngest at the company.
Mhm.
Most of the people there are either in their high 20s or in their 40s. Very surreal experience seeing these people get shit faced. Very surreal.
There, there's a lot of stories like I've heard from my sister who recently she got her master's in biology this year, and now she's working at like a pharma company.
Yeah.
And she told me stories about like how there exist videos of her boss in garters. Her boss, a man in his 60s,
Yeah.
in
I
like
mean,
garter straps.
like my thoughts on alcoholism in general aside, it's jarring to say the least. Seeing these people with wives and kids just lose control.
Yeah.
Obviously, most people are adult and mature, and they take a couple of beers, they maybe get a little bit drunk, and then obviously because I'm working at a factory, you have those people who are uh, trying to relive the glory days of when they were
Mm.
20 and still had aspirations in life. And and in particular, one guy who I actually work quite closely with, he's like my mom's age,
Mm.
so like 45 to 50, somewhere around there. Um, he just became the most abhorrent individual I've seen
Oh
in my
God.
entire life. Yeah, no, he was spouting all sorts of sexist, racist, homophobic garbage out of his mouth.
You hate to
Uh,
see it.
yeah, it's uh, yeah. I ordered a glass of white wine, and that was enough to release the
Oh God.
hounds, so to say.
That's whack.
Yeah, I mean it's the
Wow.
most cost effective.
I mean, it also tastes like shit, but that's a different story.
You drink rum and coke.
I live in a wine region and I hate wine, so you know.
Yeah, switch with me. You can have my coworker.
No.
Yeah, no, it was not the best part of the night. Was
Mm,
seeing him point to girls who may be underage, even definitely younger than me,
mm.
and saying things that I will not repeat on this podcast because they're quite vulgar. But they were sexual in nature.
That just means they are worse than constantly talking about cum rags.
I mean, we do it as a joke gimmick. We don't sexually harass anyone or talk
That
about
is
things we
true.
would do to them.
That is true.
Most likely that they would not give consent to, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
it's very strange how such behavior is normalized in society. It
that's
was
true.
evened out though, because the guy to the left of me, he he's probably like 38, something like that. I've almost never talked to him. He works in the printing department. I work in the packing department.
Mm.
Um, he also got extremely shit faced drunk, and he started telling everyone about his marriage troubles.
Ooh.
How he's going to marriage counseling once a month. Um, and obviously the other guy who's really drunk, he chimes in at every note. He's like, no,
Oh, yeah.
you should just dump her sorry ass, get with someone younger. And he's like, no,
Mm,
no, no, it's so helpful to have a third party there who can help you guide yourself through your emotions and stuff. Fairly reasonable things that I wasn't really expecting from him. Just completely shot down by this other drunk asshole.
oh, lovely.
Yeah, he started telling me I should start investing my money because
Mm,
when he was my age, he spent all his money on alcohol and drugs, and
mm,
now all he has is a wife and 3 kids and an apartment and 2 dogs.
mm. Yeah, and it's yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, that was my work event. Then we tried to get everyone to go to the club just because it's fun to see old people at the club.
Mm.
Uh, we only got the guy who had marriage issues. We got him to come with us.
Okay.
Yeah. And then at the club, I was rescued by some friends of mine. So,
Nice.
all's well that ends well. It was a strange experience.
I believe you.
Yeah. How would you rate that?
That's probably a 3.
That's a 3.
Yeah, the story could have had more ups and less sexism.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't get physical.
Yeah.
I can give
Yeah.
him that. There was a really funny part where he tried to get the attention of a girl a couple tables away,
Mhm.
but he didn't know her name. So we just started telling him random names, and he would start shouting them. He never got her
God.
attention.
Oh.
And
Oh.
I would go, maybe she's deaf. It's like, what do I do then? I go, you should wave. He starts waving like an idiot, and I go, you know what? Maybe she's blind too.
Oh God.
Yeah, I mean, you have to find some way to take the edge off.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
But yeah, I think that's my only stories. So that's a 5 for my the only time I've been complimented in my 21
Yet.
years of age.
No.
And then a 6 for Ali interviewing me, and then a 3 for my work party. Yeah. I'll keep track of these scores.
We'll work on it.
We'll work on it. We'll workshop it. I'll be back with more stories at some point in time. But what I really wanted to talk about, because originally I was planning to just do this with like 10 other bullshit stories. That wouldn't be fun content. Yesterday, I watched 2 movies, actually. One of the movies is just a movie. It's just called the title. The other one is called Chapter 2. Can you guess which movies I've seen?
Is it John Wick?
Did you look at my Letterboxd?
No, but that's the first thing that came to mind is Chapter 2.
It's John Wick. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I watched it with my mom and her fiance.
Okay.
And you know what? It wasn't at all what I thought it would be.
What did you think it would be?
I thought that John Wick 1 would be a super cool, really badass action movie about Keanu Reeves beating the shit out of people. At least the first one, it wasn't that. The first movie was, for the first bit of it, was actually a very interesting and well-made, I think, depiction of like grief and loss and loneliness. Done very well by Keanu. Shot well, edited well. Then you get the ramping up of it, which I really loved. Where they go around and Keanu Reeves, he's the most badass guy in the world. And they definitely messed with the wrong guy, right? And so, at this point, I'm thinking this is a 5 out of 5 movie, right? This has everything I want. It even goes a bit, diner-esque.
Okay.
With
sure, yeah.
Have you seen John Wick?
I've seen the first one.
Yeah. Like the like bounty hunter assassin organization that exists in the world.
I think for anyone listening to here, we don't really need to explain John Wick, but we should shortly explain Diner.
Oh, yeah. So, obviously, John Wick is an action movie starring Keanu Reeves. Everyone knows that. It was a phenomenon when it came out. Diner is a movie by Asuka?
Mika Ninagawa.
That we watched in the group watch, actually. One of the earlier ones. It's a movie that is extremely my kind of movie. It's about a girl who, without any real direction in her life, she ends up attached in criminal activities. She ends up indebted to a guy who owns a diner that serves exclusively the world's most, or the nation's, I guess, most frightening criminals and bounty hunters and assassins.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's the trials and tribulations of living there with the constant threat of being killed if she messes anything up. It's a very cool movie.
Yeah, but and now that you mention it, it's also like Dinah could be like a John Wick side story.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The diner-esque parts of John Wick were what really drew me in, and because of that, like the early parts of the movie really had me,
Mm,
because it's not just one guy um, being a fucking badass. It's uh, some really nice world building about this almost secret society that exists, like in the world, like just everywhere. They have these cool coins that they can do whatever they want with.
mm,
Um, they have these Bond-esque scenes where he gears up and they show him the gadgets and whatnot. I guess it's not really gadgets, but cool weapons, more like.
mm,
Um, and so you have all these, and there's the hotel where all the assassins hang out, and they can't kill each other on the hotel because it's neutral ground. And the guy who runs it is this really cool, laid back, older gentleman who you just know can fuck anyone up. And the guy in the register is this really cool, like guy who just stands there and he's like, "Oh, I've been expecting you, Masterwick," and So at that point, the movie really had me. Then I watched John Wick get his fucking ass beat for an hour
okay.
in a movie that so far had built him up as being the Kirito of action movies.
Mm,
And that's not what I wanted to see at all. Which is a shame. So the first John Wick movie, it didn't really do it for me, honestly. A lot of the action scenes were cool. There was some
mm,
nice fight choreography, which, as you and Leather know, that's the thing that gets me going.
mm.
But overall, I thought that the movie didn't really perform the narrative it wanted to tell. The second John Wick movie is where it gets nuts. You hadn't seen it, right?
No, the second
You
one I've
should
not seen.
see it because this one absolutely delivers. It goes way deeper into the kind of spy network-esque stuff I was talking about. There's scenes where like, oh, I'm putting out a contract on John Wick. I want him killed. And then you just see like people all around him getting notifications in their phones. And just a bunch of these really cool scenes. Even like with cinematography and stuff, it really ramps up in the second one. There's a really nice scene where he's on the subway. And it's like the lighting is done in such a way that even like in a crowd of people trying to stay inconspicuous, he's very much the center of attention for you, the viewer, while not being the center of attention in the actual movie itself. That I thought was really, really nicely done for just like 1 second cut in frame, you know?
Yeah.
um, yeah, just a banger movie in general. And then this one, Keanu Reeves is actually like an unstoppable killing machine.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to like pull this out too long because there's a thing. But what John Wick, the original at the very least, does is right. It tries to reinvent Hollywood action.
Yeah,
In that, before that, I mean, if you look at Hollywood action, there's been like many different movements, right? We had obviously the '80s with like a Rambo with Stallone and with Schwarzenegger. Then in the late '80s, we got Die Hard, where these unkillable machine, like these, these tanks were removed, and Bruce Willis in Die Hard is just a dude. He's like a
yeah, he's
normal,
just a
vulnerable
smart
dude.
guy.
Yeah, he's just pulling through, like barely, right?
Yeah,
And then in the 2000s, we had Jason Statham, who tried to reinvent the modern, like the classic action hero, right? He's basically unkillable. The difference with Statham is that he's made of rubber, so he gets beat the shit out of him,
yeah,
but he always he always like gets up again, right? Schwarzenegger, you could shoot at him and the bullet would like fly off,
yeah,
right? He would repel bullets, and Statham would fall down and just get up again.
yeah.
And
I mean, you can probably do that in real life too.
yeah, probably. And Liam Neeson did like a similar thing. Just he was like he didn't even get up again, right? He was just like an old dude who gets beat up. Uh, but again, he's pulling through, right? He's
Aren't we all?
like he goes more in the Bruce Willis Die Hard kind of thing. It's just like Liam Neeson is just like fueled by like his goal, which in the Taken films is getting his sister back. I think, right?
Yeah.
It's just like no matter how much he's beat down, he cannot be stopped because like his will is stronger than his body.
Yeah.
And Keanu Reeves in the original John Wick is kind of the same idea, right? We have like this more or less normal person, except like with obviously the special past, and he's just brought to like the brink of his patience. It
Yeah, I
is,
mean that's the part of the movie that I really do like is
yeah,
the build up, right?
yeah,
Like and like understated, but the comedic timing of this movie is also just fantastic.
mm,
Like the mafia boss calling the mechanic, he's like, "Why the fuck did you beat the shit out of my son?" He's
mm.
like, "Well, because he stole John Wick's car and killed his dog." And mafia boss just goes, "Oh,
Yeah. We long before we see Keanu Reeves do anything, we know that John Wick is a bad fucker, right?
yeah,"
Like we
which
have,
is such a nice breath of fresh air,
yeah,
right? Because usually how it goes in these movies, I've seen more of these movies than I want to, just because it's what my mom likes. Um, you have this mafia boss who's like this evil mastermind, and he's like, "Oh, I'm gonna get you," and he's formulating all these plans, and the guy like has to overcome it. But in this, like from the get go, it's very clear that the mafia guy doesn't even think he's gonna win.
mm,
Right? He's like, my son's probably dead. Um, get every guy you can get a hold of, and let's try to not get absolutely fucked. Let's contact every good bounty hunter we know of. Like we're pulling out all the stops because we can't beat Keanu Reeves.
mm.
But then like John Wick has issues fighting grunts and stuff. And what I really wanted to see was just him going, full sword
Yeah,
art
full
online.
mental.
Yeah,
Yeah,
full Kirito on them. Just which he does in the opening scene of John Wick 2, almost as if
mm.
to make up for their transgressions.
Nice, nice.
Yeah. There also wasn't a good rival character in John Wick 1.
Oh, does the second one have one?
The second one has several.
Oh,
Yeah, I really like John Wick 2.
yeah. I mean, the film had like the same problem that a lot of franchises have for me. Like after the first one, I just didn't see a reason to continue. Right? Like I did fairly like the first one, but it was like, okay, yeah, story over. Right?
Yeah. I mean, it's like, do you want to see Keanu Reeves beat the shit out of people?
I mean,
Uh,
I can just
Bad
watch The
guys
Matrix.
specifically?
I
Yeah,
can
I mean, you
watch the
can watch The
47
Matrix.
Ronin with Keanu Reeves. I would rather not, but
I mean, you
uh,
act like there can only be one movie. That's one thing. Uh,
I
he
mean,
doesn't beat
no,
them
but
up in the
yeah.
same way as in Matrix, right?
I'm just not a big fan of like this eternal franchising of things, right? That everything needs to be a
Yeah,
franchise
obviously,
instead of
obviously.
telling a new story with Keanu Reeves who beats the shit out of people.
Yeah, I mean, he was in Cyberpunk,
That he was.
unfortunately.
But yeah, everybody loves Keanu Reeves, right?
I
He
mean, why wouldn't you? He's a great actor, and he seems to be a really nice guy as well.
he thinks NFTs are stupid. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I love him. He
yeah,
dresses well, you know. Uh, John Wick is very attractive to some people. He's not my
yeah.
type personally. Um, but yeah. Also, th- I don't know if this is intentional. If they're making this movie on purpose just to piss me off. Um, in both John Wick 1 and John Wick 2, they hire Swedish actors with very strong Swedish accents to portray Russian mafia bosses.
Oh, oof.
I feel like the second time it's a joke because it's only for the opening scene. Like he goes to get his car back from the brother of the
Mm.
guy he killed in the previous movie. So I feel like that's like Oh yeah, it's his brother, so he also has a Swedish accent. It's Peter Stormare. But I don't know what happened there. If they thought they'd get away with it, if they generally thought like Russian and Swedish sounded the same. Is there an in-universe explanation?
Who knows? Who knows? The
Yeah, it's
nuances of John Wick accents.
it's quite insulting, honestly. But yeah, so now I've seen John Wick, and John Wick Chapter 2, and
Nice.
I'm probably gonna torrent.
Legally acquire.
Legally acquire John Wick 3 and 4 as well.
Nice.
Especially now that they've brought back the combo of Keanu Reeves and Lawrence Fishburne.
Nice.
Yeah. So yeah, that's
yeah. We could
that's me
probably
talking about a movie.
we could probably make a podcast about Diner, to be honest, or about
Yeah,
John Wick as well.
I should rewatch Diner at some point.
Yeah, I've been also meaning to rewatch it. So
I feel like that kind of movie is very much callcore. Like that goes into like the inner workings of the underground world of crime and assassination.
nice.
Yeah, but yeah, I think that's probably the important things for this podcast. You got to talk about Japanese film history. I got to learn things about Japanese history that isn't just the Warring States period from playing video games. I didn't hear you say Oda Nobunaga even once.
Damn.
Which is new to me.
Yeah, especially because I mean we did talk about the Nobu Watch, who essentially has its name from Oda Nobunaga in
That's
like
true.
3
but not
steps
the
removed.
real Oda Nobunaga.
Not the real one.
The Fate Grand Order.
Yes.
Oda Nobunaga.
The much cooler one.
Who is a small child, right?
Well, not really, but like she's
They're actually 1,000-year-old vampire.
Though apparently, no. Like what's important is that Oda Nobunaga was also super young when I think he died with like 26 or something.
Yeah, that's the dream.
Yeah, I mean that's my age, right? So like Fate Nobu is also like maybe 20.
Oh, okay.
Right, obviously in anime it looks like
that they make into children.
Yeah. It's definitely not 10 years old. Like there's there are enough characters that are indeed just little children. Nobu is not one of those. She's just small, right?
Yeah. I only know the core Fate, the Stay Nights and the Zeros.
Anyways, we'll not make a podcast about Fate Stay Night or anything, even though I have many opinions as well.
Not now. Maybe next time.
Maybe next time.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so thanks everyone for listening to our, well, probably first a bit more serious podcast. Maybe a bit more structured at least.
I think we're finding our ground a bit.
Yep. We are
using what we have at our disposal.
Mm-hmm. And still a bit too long for my personal taste, I think.
That's because you're editing it.
We're gonna keep a bit more like concise in the future. But I hope you had fun. And that's my closing words. Do you have anything else to say?
No, just thank you for sharing your movie expertise. And I mean, I guess, like we said, there's going to be more of this, probably on different aspects as well. There's obviously going to be more random episodes as well. We already mentioned we're probably doing one on Diner at some point. I have some favorite movies that I want to watch and do a podcast on. Asuka definitely has as well. And we're probably going to keep evolving as well, just as we find our footing even more. Become a generally structured and segmented podcast, as the best ones are.
Yep. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.